you, Ron, Muncie, Courtney, and the rest of the ILSI staff for inviting me here and allowing us to speak on a part of the supply chain that's not in the beginning and it's not at the consumer. So although we've heard from our colleagues at the FDA about the food contact notification, food additive petitions, and so forth, usually those of us in the middle of the supply chain are not directly involved in that. However, it's our materials and our chemical substances that are usually the subject of those food additive petitions and food contact notifications. So in this case, we're talking about those materials that would migrate from food packaging and therefore could be considered contaminant residues. And it depends on what effect they do or do not have and what level is the significance of their migration. So there's basically four major areas I'll talk about this morning. One is that the effect of these contaminant migration on either the food properties of the actual food itself, and that includes the environment around the food. So organoleptic properties when someone opens the package. And then also the safety effect. You know, what type of toxicological concern could there be depending on the level of migration. And it's important when we look at these materials, we look at them not only at the material level, which is how suppliers send them to us and we buy them, but the chemical composition of those materials. And what are those substances? Do we know what they are? Can we identify them? And do we know where they stand in any related regulations or compliances from either the regulatory bodies themselves or the brand owners, the consumer product groups? And it's important that there is a collaboration along the food packaging supply chain. When we look at these materials, it's pretty much a handoff. It's a working relationship. And it also ties into our product stewardship. Those of us at the middle of the packaging supply chain want to ensure that our products, as they get incorporated into the packaging article, are safe for use. And then I'll touch on, but won't define too much, the different types of substances, the main two types, which is, are they intentionally added as a material that we've purchased and a chemical in it, or are they non-intentionally added substances? And I'll give some examples of the migration of those. So the first one would be the food properties and the safety effects. What we want to look at is if we detect migratory substances, or we use another type of assessment. So there's really three types. 100% migration calculation, a worst case scenario, or there's migration modeling, which we'll be talking about, or there's migration testing itself. And then once we do that, what's the effect? What would be the effect of those chemical substances on the properties of the food? Organoleptic properties or texture properties? And then also what's the effect on the safety of the consumer? And if they do migrate and they do affect the food, therefore then the food is adulterated. Depending on the level, but the impact should have no unintended effect. And when that does happen, then that substance is a chemical contaminant residue. What we look at in the food packaging supply chain, I work for a printing inks, coatings, and pigments company. So we add the color that you see on the graphics. But we team up with our customers who are the converters, the packages themselves, the ones that actually create the package. And we look at everything up to where that package gets delivered to the filler, so that we understand that that's pretty much where we now have to do the handoff, and that's where our regulatory compliance kind of stops and our product stewardship begins. So if we're going to define contaminant substances, we must really be able to do that by clearly understanding, one, their regulatory compliance. So we have to do a review of all types of regulatory compliances. Are these chemicals legal to be in the country that they are in? Are these chemicals have toxicological concerns? Do these chemicals that are present meet all the different types of compliances that we know to be in packaging regulations, toxics in packaging, all types of regulations that guide the regulations, guide the safety of packaging, besides also the FDA or the other types of food agencies that look at the safety. And when we do that review, we do the review at a chemical substance level. I keep repeating that because it's so critical. People look at materials, but we look at the chemicals. And in order to do that, then we have to, once we know that the identification of these chemicals, now we can design the testing. And Jason and Kurt described those things more in depth with the FCN and so forth. And once we're able to do that, we're able to perform this, what I like to call user compliance migration testing. It's not for the submission of an FCN. It's not for the approval of a direct food contact material, but it is to ensure that there is a quality control and understanding of whether or not there are chemicals of which we know are present, would migrate at significant levels that would have an unintended effect on the food. So for European and North America, these are really our main regulatory bodies, the FDA, Health Canada, and the European Commission. And we look at these regulations from not only the overall standpoint, but also some of the details that are applicable. One of the interesting things, there's been a lot of discussions. I remember going to a lot of seminars in DC on food packaging law, and I recall when it first rolled out the FCM program in 2000, I think it was, right? There was a really, at those meetings, there was a representative from Health Canada, there was a representative from the FDA, and there was a representative from the European Commission. So I think Dennis Cheeseman might have been the one that was then the director, Luigi Rossi from Europe, and Michael, I forget the last name, was from Health Canada. It seems over the time that though there's been a little bit of separation or a perception of separation, but in fact, actually, in my opinion, it's a lot closer than what people think. They may not be the direct collaboration, but the principles are the same. Basically, whether it's the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, or whether it's the European Commission Framework Regulation, or whether it's Health Canada's Food Inspection Agency, it's basically the same principle. Nothing can come from the package during that whole life cycle of from the time the materials are made to the time it's transported to the filler that affects either the properties of the food or the safety of the food. So the principles are the same. The application of the principles, that's where we start to differ. And the testing is where we differ. But the principle of the regulations are the same. And the other balance of looking at these chemical substances to determine whether are they really contaminant residues, are these migratory substances, chemicals of concern that we have to actually look at closer. The other piece is that not only do we look at the regulations and the regulatory bodies, but we look at the consumer product groups, those that are selling these products into the market. Those are the ones that get the accolades and very good press, or they get issues that many times are not focused into chemistry, but are more consumer perception. And so over time, we have these different types of consumer product groups depending on their market and their type of packaging and the type of food that they're packaging, well, they've come up with different types of lists or guidances. Some of them are approved chemicals and certain levels that could be in the package after it's tested. Some of them are exclusion lists, where they say, well, I don't want these type of chemicals, we don't want these type of chemicals, those type of chemicals. They depend on the type of raw materials and how those raw materials are used. So in our case, we're talking about different types of packaging materials, either as the substrate or different type of packaging inks and coatings and different types of adhesives and those type of materials that are used to make them. They have detailed questionnaires at the Chemical Abstracts Registry number and different types of compliances that tie into these questions, which roll down to us and we ask of our suppliers. There are requirements for different type of testing, odor testing, and types of migration testing that are applicable to the type of package that they're selling into the marketplace. They look at good manufacturing practices audits, either related to non-direct food contact materials or direct food contact materials. And although the regulations look at all the components of the packaging material as sometimes being the same components, in essence, there's a different level of severity in terms of those controls that you would need to have in place if you're making the direct food contact material as opposed to the other elements of the package. For example, hygiene comes into a big piece of that play. And then they look at also the compliance to food packaging regulations, of course, or local regulations. It could depend on what country. I didn't mention other parts of the world that are becoming more and more part of our market, whether it's Asia or Latin America. In the Pacific, the Southern Pacific, we have to look at all these different elements. And then the third tier, besides regulatory bodies, besides compliance to consumer product groups, is what is the consumer's safety issue when the consumer is taking in this food and enjoying this food, and then also what is their perception, because in food packaging, perception is reality. So whether or not the science states one thing, it could be something else. And I'll just say one word, but it's really 3 letters. If it had a longer name, maybe we wouldn't have had a problem. BPA. So these are examples to put into context of the type of packaging, just examples of packaging that I'm speaking about. One would be flexible, what we call flexible packaging or snack food packaging. So this is where it's a solid material inside the package. The air environment, the environment around those chips is very important. So the type of testing that brand owner would do has to do mostly with the odor, and the type of inks that are used use some form of organic solvents and water mixtures, depends. Sometimes they're organic solvents, sometimes they're water, but they also would have, let's say, like glycol ethers, those type of chemicals. So their testing would be volatile type of testing. So we call that Headspace testing. And the same goes for confectionery. That would be the type of test that would be done there. And they also have some type of odor and taste flavor test that they do. But when we talk about, let's say, cereal boxes, these are folding paperboard cartons, and they have a different type of concerns. They may or may not use recyclable materials. Now, because of the concerns with some of the chemicals migrating from recyclable materials, like mineral oils, which I'll leave to Stephen to talk about, they've started to look at primary packaging and say, hey, you know what? Let's not use these recycled materials. And the minerals actually come mostly from newspaper print. But they have a different concern. So their migration testing may have to do more with the semi-volatile materials. And there's a different type of way that we do that testing with food simulants, liquid food simulants. And the same would go with the juice drink Now, as we learned, this juice is being consumed usually by toddlers or children. And so there could be a different consumption factor. But these same containers could also contain formula. Now that means we have to do a whole different type of testing. We have to look at what's the migration testing that's applicable if it's an infant formula. And then we have juice carton containers, which could have other types of inks. They could be cured by a different mechanism. So for example, ultraviolet curing. They may have chemicals in them that help with that type of curing, called photoinitiators. So if anyone's heard of benzophenone migration in food packaging, that's the type of the type of chemical that used to be used in food packaging inks. But because of not so much the health, but the sensory perception, the odor, that's been formulated out of food packaging inks. But one of the questions I have for this room and for all of us that work in this field is, so we have all these regulations, we have all these compliances. I have a form that's like so long, it's daunting that I give to my suppliers. I feel bad for them. I would like to help them fill it out. So we're always working at the balance of how much do we ask versus, what do we do with that information, and do we make sure that we get something that can come back that's usable? And I'll speak about that in a little bit. But if we start to over-regulate the components of the package, and especially those that give the graphics, then maybe that's going to be our package. We can just have no name, no brand, no graphics. Because our limited maybe be like maybe a brown, an orange, I don't know. Not too many colors that you're going to be able to make from that. So that's why it's a practical application of these regulations. You have to look at what do they mean? What's the significance? Because we have to make these packaging attractive to the consumers. So we can't just regulate everything out. We have to control it. We have to understand it. So in that case, we have to be able to identify and minimize the contaminants, know what's there, and then formulate through our technological expertise, how do we then reduce the migration of these chemicals that have a higher potential to migrate. So one of the things we do is, first of all, we make sure that we identify all the substances in the material, and I talked about that, looking at the chemicals that are there, not only the raw material, but everything. Is it intentionally added? Is it non-intentionally added? Is it the reaction byproduct as an impurity, or is that chemical present even at a small amount because it was added with part of the formulation? It's part of the ingredients. And then that allows us to control our chemical contaminant migration so that we don't have unintended food additives. Then we can formulate the way we want. We can make sure that the structure is correct in terms of the package. Make sure that the converters that we work with convert it in the right way to ensure that it's cured or formed into the film that it needs to be. That we do other things, maybe have a coating over it. So there's different things that could be done to control migration. That there was a storm. It's just workers. And part of that is understanding the drivers of migration themselves. Time, temperature, conditions of use, storage conditions. Is it being held in a hot trailer in Texas, or is it in northern states, a cooler climate? One of the biggest things, though, is the challenges of being able to identify these contaminants, to know their significance, is that many times along the supply chain, suppliers do not disclose all the chemical composition. So now it becomes an investigation. Many times they state proprietary information. They'll fill out the regulations or the questions we ask them, but they'll say the chemical composition is proprietary. And I don't blame them. In many cases, along the supply chain, companies are actually competitors in the same field. So it's difficult to make that disclosure to directly to the next step in the supply chain. And there's just a wide range of compliances and regulations. Everything's going global, so you not only have to know about your local regulations, I have to know about the US, I have to know about all over the country, all over the world, different regulations. And there's different levels of sophistications in the supply chain. There are suppliers that know more, and there are suppliers that know a lot less. So if we have proprietary chemical packaging condition, materials, what do? We have to find out. Is it intentionally added, or was it non-intentionally added? Is it proprietary? What kind of information can we gather to investigate that? Technical data sheets and so forth. And then once we do that, we can then help to say, okay, what is the identity of that? And if the supplier shrugs their shoulders and say, I don't know, then we have other ways of going around that. We may pass them then on to down the supply chain to the actual consumer product groups themselves, so that they can contact them and determine how to ensure that they get that information. This is where we sit in the food packaging supply chain, in the middle, the packaging supplier, as I said it before. And basically, this really is teamwork. Cooperation is critical. When we look at source of contaminant, I want to give the perspective that it's not just one piece of the package. There are different elements of the packaging, whether it's the press room, whether it's the materials that go into the construction of the package, whether it's the inks and coatings, or whether it's actually the environment that it's kept in. Are there pesticides being used? What kind of good manufacturing practices are in place? They're all very important. In terms of intentionally added and non-intentionally added substances, I do know that ILSI Europe had actually done some work on that. I think there was a working group and published a report last year, or 2015. So what we look at is, are those ingredients known to have, are they going to have a technical effect or not? Are they going to affect the performance property? So, as I said before, texture and so forth. Then non-intentionally added chemicals, we know that if it's present as a known impurity, or as an unknown, or is it an unknown byproduct reaction, a reaction byproduct that we find out later when we do the testing. And usually less than 1,000 Daltons, a molecular weight of 1,000 or 500, depending on the regulation, is where we look. So here's the different types of migration testing we do. One would be headspace analysis, I said before. That's for the solvents, those volatile materials. Then there's food simulant migration, which employs a migration cell to extract only what would be extracted from the food contact material itself. I have some data here, and I'm not going to go into the details, but just know that these are the type of migration testing that we do. There's two types here. One would be the food carton, like that juice carton, where we perform the food contact notification guidelines for migration testing, and we have a whole detailed litany of chemicals that we identify. And then what we do is determine how much of those chemicals are present. Now this is migration testing. Many times this is on trial packages. So adjustments are made depending on these findings in terms of the curing, the lay of the ink, the speed of the presses, and that's pretty much what we use this for. And I'd like to thank Dr. Tom Hartman from Rutgers for this data. Another example is what we call chloropropanols, and this is in paper. This is in paperboard manufacturing, and they're actually from wet strength resins that are additives in the paper. So as opposed to inks and coatings, now these are components of the paperboard itself, components of the substrate. And when we did these quantitation, we found that these byproducts of one of the resins used that are carcinogenic, that they actually did migrate. And their migration levels depended on the engineering of the package itself, the thickness of the food contact layer material, which is a polyethylene type sealant film coating. And it meant everything. In many cases, these studies that I did actually showed that when they engineer it properly, there was no migration of these chloropropanols, even though they were present in the paperboard. So those are two examples of one that's intentionally added substances, which are these ingredients of inks and chemicals, and one is that non-intentionally added substance, which is a byproduct of a reaction of a material used in the manufacture of the paper, of the substrate of the packaging itself. So hopefully, it gave a good perspective of that piece of the supply chain that's in the middle, the food packaging material suppliers, and the way we work together to ensure that there are not migrant contaminant residues at a significant level that could affect the safety and property of the foods. We look to identify those through our understanding of the chemicals and what's the chemical composition. And we work through that supply chain, going from our direct responsibility to safety through our product stewardship, which is the consumer use and the conditions of use. And examples of those two main types of intentionally added substances and non-intentionally added substances, both of which may migrate at significant levels and then have an unintended effect on the food itself, and thereby having the effect on the foods where now they are, in essence, violating the regulations. Some people like to say illegal. I don't like to say illegal, but there would be concerns. Oh, thank you very much. Oh, wow, 0 minutes.
We probably have time for one question for Greg.
Long, make it a long one.
So skip the BPA thing.
Yeah, don't.
Hi, great talk. Coming to your point of, the migration that causing the changes in the food product composition, assuming that there is a certain level of migration, how does that relate to the definition of organic food products? Or in other words, could I be able to challenge Whole Foods saying that your products are not as organic as you thought they are?
Actually, that's a really good question, because one of the important pieces is to differentiate between food and food ingredients and what concepts of descriptors are used in food ingredients, like organic, kosher, and so forth, versus the materials of construction of the packaging. And I think that's always mixed up. And it's a state of concern and confusion within the packaging supply chain. But that, to me, would be not applicable. It would be more about the regulation of its effect on the food, not whether it's okay, so it's an organic chemical. Those are organic chemicals, so it's organic. No, it's not organic. Organic means the way it's farmed, it's manufactured, right? So I think that's a really good question, what we struggle with all the time. The difference between food ingredients and food regulations versus the packaging regulations and where that line of delineation is. Thank you.
Thanks, Greg.